Good morning, brethren. Time for us to go ahead and get started. We're in Judges chapter 14 this morning. Last week we got to talk about the birth of Samson, but not anything about his life yet, more about his parents and kind of the strange events surrounding his birth. There's kind of a foreshadowing of the birth of Christ involved there, but Samson's life is not going to be much of a foreshadowing of Jesus. I think you could probably make some connections there, but generally, Samson is not going to be a good judge. We're following the same pattern that we followed throughout the whole book. Remember, the character of the judges represents the character of a nation as a whole. So we started with Othniel being this righteous hero of faith, and we've come all the way down to Samson, who's going to be ruled by his own lusts and passions and selfishness, and more just makes trouble everywhere that he goes. So question number one, we're not actually going to answer this way. I want to flag it here for you because I want to talk about it as we go through the sequence of events. But it reads, write down all the ways that Samson either violates or nearly violates a Nazirite vow placed on him here in chapter 14. And so keep that in mind. We talked about that Nazirite vow that was imposed upon him before he was even born. And he's not going to do a very good job of honoring that vow as we progress through these events. So what sin, question number 2, is being highlighted in verses 2 through 4? And how is God going to use this sin? Yes, this is going to be the way that God starts the conflict between Israel and Philistia. The Philistines have been oppressing the people for some time already, and Israel is not prepared to resist them. This is going to take kind of a different turn than what we've seen in the past. Before we've had a judge rally the people to battle and begin this sort of crusade to free Israel from their oppressors. It's not exactly the way that Samson's going to do things. He doesn't really lead anybody into battle at any point in this, but he does a lot of fighting on his own. And it's got to be instigated by this conflict, this very personal conflict that he has with the Philistines, that all begins with him wanting this wife. I want you to notice that it says that it was a wife that was right in his eyes. When his parents object, they say, we don't want you to marry this Philistine woman. He says, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. And this will be a running theme for Samson. He does what is right in his eyes. He does what looks good to him and seems good to him moment by moment. There is none of this, working for the cause of the Lord and doing what God has commanded. It's all about, how do I feel at this moment, and how do I satisfy whatever urge or desire that I have? So this is the first of several women that we will learn about in Samson's story. But it's not just going to be about the women involved. There will be other problems with Samson as well. Yes. Right. Yes. So last week we talked about some of the The things people were doing to like marry outside of a tribe to try to establish political connections like that, and that was okay to marry outside of a tribe. It was not okay to marry the Gentiles around them, to marry these pagan people. And remember that the Nazirite vow is supposed to be this, it's not just a list of restrictions, it's a vow of being particularly devoted to God. And this is not what somebody who is particularly devoted to God does, marrying this Philistine woman. And it was going to create all sorts of problems for Samson and be the beginning of a whole host of conflicts. So Samson has no personal desire to deliver Israel. He's not looking at the plight of Israel and saying, this is terrible that we are oppressed by the Philistines. Israel doesn't even seem to be saying that exactly. They have not asked for deliverance. They do not even seem to consider themselves oppressed, though they are. They consider themselves to live with the Philistines, and the Philistines are the neighbors who are not particularly nice to us, and they make things difficult for us, but they're also the people that we live with and in many ways identify with. And so there's a blurring of the lines of who is enemy and who is friend. So some of the other events that happen before we get to question 3, he does go ahead and marry this woman. His parents aren't happy about it, but they decide, we'll get this woman for him. Verse 4 is what tells us that this was going to be used as an opportunity by God. Then, when he is traveling down the road, a young lion comes toward him roaring, and he's now in, I was going to say hand-to-hand combat. That's not really the right explanation, I guess. But he's now fighting for his life against this lion, and he kills it with his bare hands. So very early on in this, we have learned something about Samson's strength. That is not an easy thing to do. A lion is a very powerful animal. And this is something that if he's really being attacked, that he could easily die or be gravely wounded from it. But he kills it with his bare hands. He doesn't have a weapon that he is using even. It says that this happens only because the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. So this is specifically power given to him by God. It is not just that he is an obscenely powerful, physically powerful person, but that he has power from God. I think sometimes we get the idea, or when we see illustrations of Samson, that he was like a great, hulking, physical giant of a man. That was probably unlikely. If you think about how later on the Philistines were working so hard to figure out the source of Samson's strength. When you see a man who's got 50-inch biceps, do you go, I wonder what the source of his strength is? No. You go, that is a pretty built man, and he obviously has physical power. Samson has this strength, but it doesn't seem like that he should. So he probably didn't look much different than any ordinary person that they knew, yet he has the power to kill a lion with his bare hands. Okay. Yeah. Although I believe they had weapons, so that helps. David certainly did. I'm not sure about Benaiah, but Samson specifically says he didn't even have a weapon with him. So yeah, it is possible, but it's certainly not going to be an easy thing to do, and certainly going to be a display of power. We have another problem that comes with it, though. It was not wrong for Samson to defend himself against this lion. He's been attacked. It doesn't say he went out of his way to fight this lion, but there's a component with the Nazirite vow that's a problem. What's the issue here? Right, yeah. So now he has touched a dead body, and that's not something that a Nazirite is supposed to do. Now, it doesn't invalidate the Nazirite vow or anything. There was a mechanism for what you're supposed to do when that happens. They knew that sometimes you might come in contact with a dead body even if you weren't trying to, but there were things that needed to happen. He needed to offer a sacrifice, a very particular sacrifice. He needed to cleanse himself. He needed to rededicate himself to that Nazirite vow, rededicating himself to God. He doesn't do any of that. That it does not come across as important to Samson at all. He's not making the effort to honor this Nazirite vow already for the second time in this chapter. He's marrying the outsider, and he is somewhat flippantly coming in contact with this dead body without doing anything about it. You might be willing to cut Samson some slack on the dead body thing, because what was he supposed to do? Not defend himself, and there'd be a point there. Again, the issue isn't so much that he killed the lion. The issue is that he did not do what was necessary after the fact. Of course, we'll see that he's going to go back to the lion, and that makes it harder to justify anything that Samson is doing. So he's traveling down the road. He doesn't tell his father and mother about this, probably because they would tell him what he needs to do as a Nazirite. So he doesn't even mention that he has killed the lion. He's going and talking with this woman that he's wanting to marry. And then some days later, he's going to actually take her as his wife. And this time, he goes out of his way to get to that the spot where he killed that lion. It says specifically, verse 8, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. So the first time the lion came to him, and there wasn't a whole lot he could do about that. The second time he went to the lion, and now it is not a threat to him, now it is not attacking him, yet he is going to touch it again anyway. This is not anything that he needed to be doing as a Nazirite. There was no point to this, and he has made himself unclean again. So what does he see when he goes over to the lion's carcass? Yeah. Okay, so a swarm of bees there in the body of a lion, and they've made honey, and he takes some of that honey there in his hand, in the carcass of a lion. That doesn't sound super appetizing to me. But he does that, and he eats that honey. And also, what else does he do with the honey? Yeah, he takes it home to his parents and offers it to them. So he has now kind of spread this uncleanness, something that has come in contact with a carcass. Now this lion's body has been sitting here for some days. We don't know how many days, but you know what happens to dead bodies when they've been lying around for a while. This is not a particularly sanitary thing, and also there is covenantal uncleanness that is involved in this. Yet none of this matters to Samson. He is fine to take this honey. He's fine to give it to his parents. It doesn't matter to him that this is bringing uncleanness to them. And once again, he hides where it came from, doesn't tell anybody, including his parents, that this came from the carcass of a lion. Beginning in verse 10, they're getting the marriage feast together. So he is going to marry this woman. And it says that Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. So I think we can understand from that that he's following the pattern and the traditions of what they did in marriage feasts. And so that would probably have meant that wine was served at this feast. And that probably means that Samson partook of that wine as well, which violates his Nazirite vow. You could argue, well, he doesn't have to serve wine at the feast, and he doesn't have to drink it, and you're absolutely right, but show me anywhere in here where Samson has self-control. He doesn't restrain himself in any way in this whole story. So we have no reason to believe that he does anything different than what the typical pattern was of their traditions, and that he partook of whatever was there. So probably he violated his Nazirite vow once again here at this feast. So now we're going to get to the next step of the conflict here at this wedding feast. So what happens at the feast that begins to get the two, Samson and the Philistines, at odds with each other? Okay. Comes up with a riddle. Okay. And who does he tell this riddle to? Okay. So he's got some Philistine young men who have come to this wedding feast. Not a real surprise since he is marrying a Philistine woman. She's got, family and friends, people from her community. Although it seems that Samson kind of has enough interaction with the Philistines that potentially they know him personally as well. And there's 30 of them. And Samson tells them this riddle. And it's more than a riddle, it's also a bet. What is the bet? Gary. Yeah. And then if they can, then Samson will give them the 30 changes of clothing. There's 30 of them, so this is stacked to where they each have a little something to gain. Samson potentially has a lot to gain, but hey, it's unbalanced because there's 30 of them that get to try to figure out this riddle. Sounds like a fun wedding game to play, I guess. So we're going to have this riddle, and we're going to try to see if they can come up with the answer. But I have to say, Samson is kind of bad at riddles, because this is not a riddle that anybody could know the answer to without knowing what happened to Samson. And so either we have to believe that Samson is bad at riddles, or we have to believe that he's not playing fair, and I think it's probably the latter. That he is provoking these 30 men and trying to gain something from them by pretending that this is going to be a real riddle, but actually doing something a bit dishonest here. So the riddle reads, "Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet." So we very quickly know what that is, referring to the lion that he killed and that the bees came to that carcass and honey came out of it. But that's not like a normal thing that happens. You don't normally see bees making honey inside of a lion's carcass. And so that's not something that they would have any expectation to be able to come up with. Again, we know riddles. We know there's usually a little bit of cleverness to them, things that have two meanings or things that are worded in maybe a misleading way, but then when you think about it a little bit deeper, you can understand this is just try to guess something that happened to me that you would have no way of knowing. And that's not a very fun game to play, but it's going to be an opportunity for Samson to try to get some changes of clothing out of this. And remember that changes of clothing, garments, like those were pretty expensive and hard to come by. We're used to clothing being something you can cheaply pick up from the store, cheaply go to the mall or buy online and get clothing you need and have a whole closet full. But for them, clothing was expensive, difficult to make, and people did not have just whole closets full of clothing unless they were quite wealthy. So question number 3, what are we learning about Samson and his wife as these events continue? Gary. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, hold on to that idea. Women are Samson's weakness, and that is not something that will end at this point in the story. Like I said, this is only the first of several women that we will learn about in Samson's life, and they are his weakness. Samson is happy to trick and provoke 30 young men. That's kind of a brash thing to do, and sounds like a good way to get yourself beat up. But it's his wife, his new wife, who is able to kind of manipulate him. So they know that they're not able to come up with the answer to this riddle. They've spent 3 days trying to figure it out. And they say, we're never going to come up with this. We don't have a clue. And so they go to her, and they say, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is. And they threaten her, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? Or some translations say, have you invited us here to rob us? So they're kind of appealing to this idea that you have invited us to your wedding, yet now we've become a part of some unfair game that's meant to separate us from our possessions. And that's not a very hospitable or honorable thing to do. You need to make this right, and if you don't, we'll kill you, and we'll kill your family. And so she attempts to do this, and you have to remember that Samson has not cared what anybody else has to think about anything so far. He's not listened to his parents. He's not told his parents anything about the lion. He's able to keep a secret just fine until a pretty woman asks him, please tell me the answer to the riddle. And he does repeatedly tell her no. He does try to resist her, but by the seventh day, because she pressed him hard, he finally told her the answer to the riddle. And then so she immediately goes and tells these wedding guests, and they're able to come to Samson and give the answer to the riddle. The way they give the answer to the riddle is kind of clever, because they don't just say, a lion and honey. They say it as kind of a riddle in return. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And the answer for Samson is a woman. A woman is sweeter than honey, and she's stronger than a lion, because she manipulates you to get the answer. And so it's their way of both giving him the answer and also jabbing and saying, we got the answer from your wife. They have no reason to hide that that's how they did it. This is not a game, even though it was sort of presented as a game. This is a conflict and a struggle between them, and they are happy that they got the upper hand by using his wife. Again, fun wedding activities here, so fun. And they've really created a very bad dynamic that is going to get a lot worse as time goes on. Samson's response is, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. You don't plow with heifers. And so he's accusing them of playing unfairly. You went to my wife when you were supposed to just come up with the answer to this on your own. So he's indignant that they wouldn't play fair, even though he wasn't really playing fair in the first place. Yet what's done is done. They've come up with the answer to the riddle. So Samson's got to come up with 30 changes of clothing to give to them, which he does not have. He was not expecting to need to come up with this. So this has been a very unwise bet, if there ever was a wise bet. And he decides to resolve this by going and getting some. He travels a long distance away, probably to hide what he's doing, to a city called Ashkelon. And he will get his changes of clothing there. So we'll answer question number 4 to talk about that. What is giving Samson his strength according to chapter 14? The Spirit of the Lord. We saw it with a lion. We're going to see it here too, that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, verse 19, and he went down to Ashkelon. And what does he do there? Well, that's one way to get 30 changes of clothing. Just go kill 30 men and take them. Inventive, I guess, if not particularly nuanced. And so he's able to come up with this. He returns to them, gives them the garments, and he's quite angry about this whole thing. Now, again, we've noted that his strength comes from the Lord, yet he's not really using that strength in a way that is pleasing to the Lord, right? Like that's got to be obvious to us. With the lion, you can go, well, maybe this is somewhat neutral. He should have handled that differently afterwards. But much more definitively, he should not have gone to Ashkelon to randomly murder 30 people and take their clothes. Like that was not what needed to happen. Even with a conflict between Israel and Philistia, like this was to settle a bet. This is conflict for the sake of conflict. This is not about liberating Israel at all. This is different than those battles where God is delivering his people. This is Samson saying, I need to settle a bet. And because I don't have the 30 changes of clothing that I wagered, I'm going to go kill people to get them. There's nothing honorable or righteous about that. This is purely self-motivated. Yet, it is something that God is going to use because it's going to continue to ratchet up the tension between Israel and Philistia and bring more conflict down the road. What is the other side effect of his angry attempt to go settle this bet and traveling far away? Gary. Yeah. It's been kind of strange what happens here. So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the people at this wedding. Right at the end, it's a 7-day wedding feast. That was typical then, and that's what happens here. 7-day marriage feast. And right at the end of it, sundown of the last day, Samson has been had. They've been able to get this, to win the riddle, win the bet. And so he angrily storms off to get the 30 changes of clothing, and he's gone for a long time. I don't mean a couple hours. Like, he travels a long way to go to this city of Ashkelon. He kills those 30 people. He comes back and gives them what they are owed, and then he just goes to his parents' house. So a long time has passed, and he married this woman, but like he doesn't actually seem to take her as his wife. They've not, have you ever been to a wedding and the bride and groom didn't leave together and they didn't go to the same home and they didn't live, it's weird. It doesn't seem normal. It's not normal. They've not made a home together. They've not, come together as husband and wife. Samson has left in a rage. And so the result of this is the woman's father does not believe that Samson wants her. He believes that he has actually abandoned her. And so this is a bit of a disaster. She's married a man who does not want her. This needs to be resolved lest she be alone. And so he gives her to the best man. This is soap opera stuff, guys. It's just, the groom has stormed off. Let's give her away to the best man instead. Just step in and take her. And that's what happens. So she ends up kind of married to Samson, at least that's what Samson believes, and kind of married to the best man. That's what everyone else seems to believe. And you can probably imagine that conflict is coming. So he eventually, after some long period of time, goes to see his wife. Says that, this is now we're in chapter 15, After some days, not sure how long, but it's at the time of the wheat harvest now, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat, and he said, "I will go in to my wife in the chamber." But her father would not allow him to go in. All this time has passed, and he's like, "I'm here to see my wife." And he comes with this young goat, and the father meets him at the door and is like, "What are you doing here? Like, you didn't take her as your wife. We had a marriage feast, but you didn't seem to want her. I really thought," it says verse 2, "I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion." So now we have something very awkward that has happened. There's been a great misunderstanding, and Samson feels like he has been wronged, though he has also wronged his wife and her family. This whole thing has become a disaster. So what is the father's solution to the problem? Okay. Oh yeah, take her sister. And in a stunning display of fatherly love, "Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." Different times, I guess. Yeah, this is more practical than it is, Disney storybook love, right? Like, you expected to get a wife from our family, and you didn't, and so here we'll give you the sister instead, and then we can resolve this problem between us. Samson is not pleased. So what does he do? Question number 5. What does he do to the Philistines in chapter 15? I think we know the why already. Yeah, burns the fields. What inventive way does he do this? Yeah. So he's captured these 300 foxes. He took torches. He's tied them in pairs of foxes with a torch tied to each pair, lights all these torches, sets them loose into the fields. Remember, it is the time of the wheat harvest, we've already been told. So there is grain that has already been harvested and is stacked up, and there is grain that is still out in the fields and needs to be harvested. And then they also have olive orchards, as we learn in verse 5, that are growing. All of these are burnt from Samson's tirade. He has done a very destructive thing. And I'm impressed with his ability to catch 300 foxes and tie their tails together. Like, I don't know how one would begin to do that. That does not sound easy at all. And surely there are easier ways to set a field on fire, but this is the way that he wants to do it. He is very inventive and very capable of wreaking havoc and destruction when he wants to. And he has shown that repeatedly. Then again, this won't even be the last time that he does that. So they have lost their entire harvest of grain, and they have lost the olive orchards as well. And olive trees take a while to grow. Those take years to grow up. So that is not just a single year that they have lost. That is a very terrible thing that has happened to them. This is a disaster that could literally mean famine for them. And the Philistines say, "Who has done this?" And they know who did it. It's not a secret. They say Samson, the son-in-law of a Timnite, and they know why he did it, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So this is all public knowledge. Everybody knows what has happened and knows that Samson is responsible for this and why he has done such a thing. And so what is the Philistine solution to this problem? Yeah. So kill Samson's kind of wife and her family, and they're kind of being held responsible for this. Which is maybe a strange solution to the problem, but I guess they're looking at this in one of two ways. Either that they wronged Samson and made him angry and brought this upon them, or that it's just simpler to deal with them than it is Samson, because Samson is kind of a scary man and does these things, these very destructive things. It is probably easier to kill the wife and family than it is to go after him, at least for now. They are eventually going to go after him as the conflict escalates. Samson believes he is totally in the right for doing this. When the offer is made for him to take the sister instead of the woman that he wanted to marry, in verse 3 he said, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. Seeming to understand that he has not always acted honorably with the Philistines, and that he has done them harm in the past without a good justification of doing so. When he goes and kills those 30 men, they did nothing to him. But this time, he's justified. This time, he believes that because he has been so wronged, he has the right to do this. But the only real result of it is that the woman that he wanted to marry and her family have been killed, and a bunch of people have lost their harvest. So what does Samson do in return once they have been killed? Goes on a killing spree. That's the answer to a lot of these questions, by the way. What does Samson do? If you don't know, you can try goes on a killing spree or finds a woman, and that's almost always the answer for what Samson does. He goes on a killing spree here. He struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, verse 8. And so the conflict has been escalated again. So this went from killing 30 people to burning the fields, to having the wife and family killed, to now just mass slaughter. And then he goes and hides because there are a lot of angry people who would like to kill him, as you might imagine. And question number 6, what is giving Samson his strength in chapter 15? Mark. The Spirit of the Lord. Yes, Mark? Yeah. Yeah. He does talk to God, and it's an interesting, So Mark's hit on something interesting here, because on one hand, we're talking about Samson's problems, and he has a lot of problems, and his motivations are not good. There is no way that we can say that Samson's motivations are good. They're demonstrably not. He is motivated by revenge. He's motivated by violence for the sake of violence. That being said, he is accomplishing what God wants, even if he doesn't realize that's what he's doing. Because Israel needs to be delivered from the Philistines. And even if they have not cried out to the Lord, and even if their judge is, and he hardly seems like a judge, but he is one, even if their judge is not really going to lead them, at no point in any of this does Samson lead Israel into battle. There is no leading. There is no Samson as the general like Gideon was, or like many of the other judges were. Samson just goes out carving his own path of destruction everywhere that he goes. So God is using this evil to accomplish something good, which is something God is very capable of doing and has done before and will do after this. But it's not because Samson is particularly trusting in God or cares anything about that mission. He is motivated by selfishness, and he is motivated by revenge. God is going to use that to deliver a people who don't even want to be delivered. So we'll develop that idea more as we go. So yes, once again in chapter 15 we are told his strength comes from the Lord. This is consistent all the way throughout. Samson is not just a naturally powerful man. He has been supernaturally given power by God that he is using in these different ways. They're not necessarily good ways, but they are accomplishing something that God wants. So as he is hiding in the cleft of the rock at Edom, now the Philistines begin raiding the Israelites. The oppression becomes a lot worse, even though there was sort of a status quo with them before. Now it's gotten bad. The Philistines are angry. They want to punish the Israelites. And the men of Judah say, why have you come up against us? What has gone wrong? They say, we want Samson. We want to bind him and do to him as he did to us. And so 3,000 men of Judah go to Samson and they say, you big dummy, what did you do? Why did you make them angry? Don't you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this thing that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. You notice that's what both sides are saying. I'm hurting him because he hurt me. And they're hurting me because I hurt them. This is just a cycle of revenge that is happening. You can follow the whole chain of events and see that everything that Samson does and everything that the Philistines do is a direct result of some harm that happened previously. And this is what happens when you can't reach a reconciliation and when you continue escalating over and over and over. So the men of Judah say, we've got to give you to the Philistines or we're all going to die. And he says, swear to me that you will not attack me, that you will just give me to them. And they say, fine, we don't have any interest in killing you. All we got to do is give you to them. That's all they want. And so they tie him up in new ropes, and they bring him up from that rock, send him over to the Philistines and say, look, here he is. Stop attacking us. The Philistines come shouting to meet him. The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him. A third time we've seen that in here. And the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and the bonds melted off of his hands. He's able to break out of these ropes like they are nothing. And so he has found the fresh jawbone of a donkey. This, again, is something that a Nazirite shouldn't be doing. Whether he is still a Nazirite, as Mark kind of was bringing up, is, I suppose, up for some debate. He's not a very faithful Nazirite, at least. But he's taken this fresh jawbone of a donkey, and this is another improvised weapon in the book of Judges. And he goes on another killing spree, killing 1,000 men just with this jawbone. And so he obviously has this great prowess, this great power to be able to do this. And he says, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, have I struck down 1,000 men. So he claims all of that credit for himself. He does not say, God has strengthened me, God has overcome them. He says, I have done this, and I did it only with the jawbone of a donkey. So up to this point, we have not seen anything in Samson's life that shows that he even knows that God is empowering him. Now, as Mark mentioned, it does seem like he knows that, and he does call upon God later, which we'll talk about next week, here starting in verse 18. But that's still going to be a bit of a strange occasion. So thank you, everybody. Next week, we'll begin in chapter 15, verse 18, and then we'll move on to question 7 after that.